Okay, so do you think we are ready for our movie of the week?
I think so.
All right, here we go. All right, so what are we talking about this week?
I don't remember the title.
I believe the title is, it's an interesting title. It's called By What Standard?
Yeah, you're right.
I don't know if it's the best titling. I think that the topic is far too specific, although, and that's not even true either. The topics are sort of wide ranging, but with a central theme. But it was put out by Founders Ministries.
hmm
Tom Askell is connected to it. But do you want to give the best sort of summary of the overarching themes of it?
Well, it really seemed to address a lot of the ways that culture, in various ways, is affecting the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah, and I would say
Um,
that's just a microcosm of the
yeah,
overall church. Although the Southern Baptist Convention is the biggest American denomination, isn't it?
that's what they claim. I would like to see the numbers on that because I've also heard that same claim from some Pentecostal
Yeah.
denominations.
Yeah,
So
although they would say they're not a denomination, they're a network more so,
yeah,
right,
yeah, that's true. That's
of
true.
Baptists.
AG
Yeah.
the AG argues that as well, that they're just a fellowship, um, but
It is
they're a
called,
denomination.
yeah, it's called By What Standard, Ash, she
Yeah.
asked in the comments. It's on YouTube, it's free, so if you want to watch
Yep.
it, I highly recommend it. Although we'll have our commentary here for sure as to what we liked about it and what we have
Yeah.
uh things to say about it, because it affects us kind of close to home as in regards to who the documentary addresses.
Yeah.
And so
I'd
uh
say the central topic of it really seemed to be critical theory and how critical theories are um, really working their way into the church world, specifically the SBC. But because of that, you've got nuances with things like feminism, egalitarianism, um, LGBTQ plus issues,
mhm.
um, a whole plethora of other issues that stem from these theories.
Yeah, the way that that's maybe one structural critique I might have with it. Maybe something they could have done, I don't know, up front in the documentary, say this is the central theme we're talking about, and then dive into the specific instances of it. Because if you were to start the documentary, you'd think the whole documentary is going to be about feminism in the church, but it's not. That's the first like third of the documentary, and then the second part is about critical race theory and intersectionality, and then
Yeah.
the final part is probably the shortest. It touches on LGBTQ, etc. issues, but the central theme among all of those is critical theories and how critical is called by whose standard. Yeah, that's probably true. We got it wrong, but the central theme is critical theories, and it shows how that shows up among with feminism. It shows how it pops up. I'd say the biggest part of the documentary is the center one on critical race theory, because it touches on a resolution that was passed in the Southern Baptist Convention and how controversial it was. Um, and then it showed the implications of embracing that, showing how um, LGBT perversions of morality can work their way into the church if you embrace a critical theory view of oppressor oppressed dynamics in all of these areas, basically. And so, boy, how do we want to dive into this? Because it's a wide ranging documentary. There's specific, I think, things we want to affirm about the issues tackled in this documentary. I do think it was a good documentary and is helpful in
Yeah.
clarifying a lot of things. But like we said, there's they address a lot of individual people in the church that we probably know a little bit more about than maybe the creators of the documentary. And so, did they swing a little too hard at too many people? That's sort of the question we're kind of
Yeah.
asking a little bit. Um, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, a couple things right off the bat. Neither you or I are part of the SBC.
no,
So we can go and just freewheel on them. No, I'm just kidding. um,
yeah,
we have no dog in that fight per se, other than the fact that it does affect Christianity as a whole.
right,
So it is an important topic, but we are not apologists for the SBC.
hmm
Neither are we um, we're not embattled with the resolution conflict. Like we have no voice in that,
Hmm.
other than as Christians brothers who can speak out against it or something.
Hmm.
But we have no vote.
Yeah.
Um, so that said, I was not as familiar with this resolution. I don't know what it states, but it did seem to be interesting in that it was divisive in many ways, but then when it was finally voted on, it passed significantly
Yeah.
in favor.
Yeah. Tom Askell and those around him, I'd say, were more of that more sort of minority movement who had a much stronger opinion concerning its Marxist origins.
Yeah.
And I don't think they go in depth very much on what they're passing in these conventions. They go, okay, we got this nice sound. It's kind of like when we're about to vote on Tuesday. It's kind of
Yeah.
like when issues are on the ballot and they have a lovely title,
Yeah.
and we go, oh yeah, that sounds good. But they don't know the academic history of any given
Yeah.
resolution. Whereas Tom Askell was very familiar with it.
Yeah.
And
I actually
so,
mentioned that on Sunday.
yeah.
In my voting history, I made the mistake one time leading up to the election of telling people to vote a certain way on an issue.
Uh-huh.
One of those, you know, Proposition 1, whatever,
Uh-huh.
vote yes, and then I realized about 2 days before the election that actually my view would be no. I
Hmm.
wouldn't want this to go into effect because it would raise taxes and that kind of thing. And so then I started frantically texting people like, "Hey, actually vote no on that. Don't vote yes on that." But the point is they're often worded in such ways that if you don't do your homework before the election, you're not going to know what you're voting on. So
Hmm.
consider that your encouragement if you're voting on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Most people, I think most voting is around the country. This is one of the midterm elections, so it's
Are there
it's wide
any
open.
are there any issues on the ballot, or is it just people? I don't even.
I need to, as I'm saying this, I was planning on spending some time tomorrow to like research the ballot a little bit more specifically. I don't
Yeah.
remember. I think there's at least one proposition here where we live.
Okay. Alrighty. Yeah, so this is tricky. I almost wish I would have written down some things to keep my thoughts organized, because
Yeah.
I want to talk about the theological, philosophical, cultural issues that are addressed in the film. But then we have to talk about the individuals actively or passively promoting these ideas,
Yeah.
and to what extent they might or might not be. But we kind of need to clarify the issues to determine that and why they're problematic. And so it's like that, I guess, organizing that so I don't get things too mixed up was not what I did the best job on. But since it's fresh in your mind, what was sort of your take sort of on the historical summary of what is sort of being imported in these ideas in terms of critical theories?
Yeah.
How did it strike you? What new things do you think you learned? Did anything go, oh, I didn't really know that?
So I guess I'm not as familiar with some of the critical theory
Mm-hmm.
and its history as probably I should be, but we live in a unique time where it's like there's so many different topics going on all the time. It's like sometimes you feel like you're just managing to keep your head above the water with being aware of every cultural issue.
Mm-hmm.
I know some things about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not completely ignorant. And so it did shine a light a little bit on. I mean, I knew that critical theory has its groundings in Marxism. I didn't know the extent of its development over time. One of the historians that was interviewed, and I'm not going to remember any names, but he talked about other um, sociologists and philosophers that expanded the work of Marx when it comes to these critical theories,
Mm-hmm.
to the point of what they are today.
Yeah.
So things that it deals with circulates around things like oppression and power issues. So there's what we find to be right and wrong really center around who has power and authority versus those who are oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And
As
so
opposed
really,
to, I think, a more Christian approach, which
yeah,
is like oppression. We're all oppressors and oppressed to an extent. we're both victimizers and we're victimized because
Yeah.
sin dwells in every heart, and so that can
Yeah.
attach itself to various people who have power, and they can do more damage. But generally, if it's a more Marxist scheme, you're going to have uh, a more divided view where there's between people, where there's like good and bad people. Uh, I think that's a result of it, at least, even though that might not be what it claims. But because it sees things as systemic, you tend to sort of divide people into groups rather than
Yeah. Yeah.
dividing the human heart between our good and bad elements.
Yeah. To
Yeah.
me, it seems, so I spent a lot more time researching things like postmodernism a few years back, so I'm a little bit rusty.
Mm-hmm.
Right when the emerging church was kicking off, I did a little bit of diving into that because, number one, I was intrigued by it, but quickly rejected it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of felt like I was obliged to at least argue with my friends and whatnot who were maybe more tempted by it. So
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit more versed in postmodern thought. Um, and to me, it seems like critical theory in some ways goes alongside postmodernity in
Yeah.
many ways, separating like into groups versus the individualism is more of like a um, modern, the modernism
Mm-hmm.
approach. In postmodernity, they would have said, especially the emerging church, that salvation was holistic, meaning it was about the community more than it was the individual. And,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, I do believe that community is very important to the Christian journey. But communities don't get saved. Individual human hearts get saved.
Right.
you know,
Yeah,
like
but I would
who's getting
like
saved here?
that was sort of the struggle I had throughout my experience being tempted by the emergent movement. Was like they would raise a question like that, and
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, but I guess I agree on your community thing, but like, what about the individual aspect? Because isn't this? And so I would just kind of be forced to assume the best, that they knew, they
Yeah.
sort
Yeah.
of agreed with me on that. But then eventually you realize, no, they don't agree on any of this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's weird. There's, for various historical reasons, I guess, like Marxism and postmodernism don't actually work together philosophically, historically. But Jordan Peterson's brought this up a bit. We've talked about him, and we've talked about uh, the Matrix and stuff like that. But sort of in this modern iteration of neo-Marxism, like there's this weird joining of postmodernism and neo-Marxism in some weird ways. Like I wouldn't be able to fully articulate that like on the spot, but I've heard it explained in the historical aspects of that explained in some interesting ways. But we talked about this a bit, and it's relevant if you want to watch our video where we talked about the Matrix. I think some of the issues are similar here in terms of linking together all of these critical theories across these different topics, even though they don't necessarily seem related. And that we see, I guess, from the 80s, a lot of this was birthed out of early feminism. And so the documentary starts in regards to trying to sort out feminism in the church, and then it moves on and it shows sort of this oppressor-oppressed narrative being brought into race, and then and so if you buy into this critical theory way of thinking in one area, it becomes inevitable that you be pressured to embrace it in these other areas. And so you'll find Christians, for instance, in the Southern Baptist Convention, they get a lot of flack because historically, supposedly, there's a lot of racism in the Southern Baptist Convention. That's the accusation. I'm sure there's elements of truth to that, given our just American history. But because there's sort of that foothold you can get, CRT, critical race theory, begins getting promoted in the Southern Baptist Convention. And it gets some traction. And then you end up seeing it, once they sort of embrace the critical race theory model of addressing racism, they then are pressured into embracing the critical theory approach to all of these issues because it's part of an overall framework. Anyways, but if you like, how would you go ahead?
I was going to say it was intriguing to me as I watched it, and then interspersed were some clips from, I guess, advocates for critical race theory. But one of the interesting things, I guess, that really stuck out was I guess you could say those accusations about things like racism or whatever in the Southern Baptist Convention. But I think where they would really plant their flag in the ground would be just the power structure. It's
Mm-hmm.
always been old white men.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where they would actually really critique you and really argue against you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we might say, well, yeah, racism was horrible, and slavery is a horrible atrocity and a stain on our nation. Their argument isn't just that racism was a thing, it's racism is a thing because look at the power structure.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's like, and it's not even just that they would say it is a thing, it's why they say it's a thing. Because even we would
yeah,
agree, I think there's going to be remnants of racism in the present. It's an aspect of human nature that we struggle with all sorts of sins, and that's one of them. Sure,
yeah,
racial superiority can crop up at any time in history. That's absolutely true.
yeah,
But built into just American culture in general, this is where the Marxism comes in, built into sort of Western American capitalistic society, racism is the normal state of affairs. And so Robin DiAngelo, like you mentioned, one of the things she said in her writings is when you approach a situation, you're not just supposed to ask the question, did racism occur? You have to ask, how did racism occur in this situation?
yeah.
It's the
It's not if, it's how.
Not if, but it's how. That's right. And so, given that, because it's seen as the normal state of affairs ingrained in our current system, and because it's built on a Marxist foundation, this political viewpoint is revolutionary in nature.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, if you buy into this model, can you all briefly explain what's going on with the SBC now? I'm really angry about it and cannot be objective. Oh, that's what Ash is saying. Well, we're given sort of the fly overview now a little bit, and we'll probably get a little more specific. But this is what we're addressing more or less. These are sort of the philosophies, the political philosophies the SBC is sort of wrestling with, and becoming a little bit divided over it, a lot of it, depending where you look. But
and I will say, just as one interjection on it, as far as the SBC, I'm not as versed as what the SBC is dealing with right now. Would it surprise me if this hasn't escalated and is more inundated? Absolutely not. It probably would. That's what I kind of would expect. But I don't know how much, because I don't really understand the SBC all that much. I don't know if they have like a central figurehead. Is it all SBC churches do what headquarters say to do, or is it more of independent churches within the greater context of this network?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the church. I do think in principle they operate pretty independently. But some...
Can you hear my daughter screaming? I just realized I think my baby monitor is on.
I haven't heard it, so I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah, but
all right.
I was gonna say, what was the last thing I said? I was saying, do you remember? I don't know. I think I remember. But I was basically saying because once you embrace this sort of critical race theory CRT model as the lens by which you address racism, because it causes you to see racism as the normal state of affairs that you are indicted by as a white person, the only way to express your repentance is by becoming a political activist in one very specific way.
Yeah.
And so therefore the solution is not going to be a sound gospel.
Right.
And so I guess that's my best summary is the critical race theory piece. But, and like I mentioned, because these schools of thought are intertwined and all of culture is seen from that oppressor-oppressed lens, once these other claims of oppression come into the church in regard to quote unquote sexual minorities or women in ministry and things like that, you're basically cornered into feeling like you have to apologize to some extent. And I feel like a lot of Christians are trying to split the difference where it's like, well, I'm still going to maintain my definitions of what sin is, but I'm going to look really hard for ways I can apologize about being mean or something. And so it's like, sometimes maybe there's truth to that, but like your motives are automatically going to be twisted because the accusation is not coming from a pure place, I think.
Yeah. I think that's the piece that's missing for a lot of people who are maybe sympathetic. Almost feels like the wrong word. They're feeling guilty. They're feeling the shame of some actions that were even legitimately wrong. You know, you look at America's history with racism, and it absolutely was wrong. But what critical race theory does, at least from my very amateurish understanding, it seems to pile on the pressure to apologize for the whole rather than individual.
And
To
that's
the
the
point
thing.
where
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, to the point where even like the way that one must repent looks different. You know, you briefly mentioned that that's the end result.
Yeah, Robin DiAngelo says it's a lifelong self-reflective process. It never ends. And that's not Christianity.
No.
Yeah.
When you when you repent and are forgiven for your sin, you're forgiven for it. Not I hated the phrase that I heard in the video from an advocate for it. You have to divest your whiteness. And how do I say this? That's not the gospel answer.
But that being said, this is where we could maybe get into the Matt Chandler thing, because again, they go after some people like in our network. Matt Chandler is he's connected to the SBC as well as Acts 29, which we're part of. Although he has a whole nother controversy going on right now, which I already addressed that in another video. We're not even going to talk about it. Anyways, there's another aspect to this before we get to him. In that, even having said, there's a tactical error, I think, in arguing against this that I think some Christians make, because we have to choose what our objection to this is. Is our objection that the accusation is true, but the gospel has dealt with it? Or is our objection the accusation is false because this system of determining sin is false? Because if critical race theory as a system is wrong, their accusation is false, and we need to say, stop accusing me of something I didn't do as a white person. And in that sense, forgiveness doesn't apply there. I'm not going to appeal to the gospel and say Christ has forgiven me for that because I didn't do that thing as you describe it. And I think some people who are objecting to critical race theory appeal to the gospel and say, oh, but the gospel, there's forgiveness. Oh, so you're conceding that you're taking part in systemic racism.
Yeah.
And then their objection back becomes valid when they say, but you're still part of the systemic problem, and so you haven't dealt with it. So I don't believe you're repentant.
Yeah, I guess to clarify what I was bringing up, if it wasn't clear.
Yeah. I think.
Yeah, I'm not advocating for the assessment. It's not a good analytical tool. You know, so if you use it as an analytical tool, you might be tempted to address it that way, to say, yeah, the sin there is exactly how you describe it, and so I do feel guilty. I think you're right. That is the misguided approach to it. And that's putting it as nicely as I can.
Yeah, and this brings us, I think, to we went back and forth here, is how we felt about how, for one example, how the documentary addressed Matt Chandler, because, like we said, he's had a long-standing, as far as we can tell, pretty basic gospel proclamation throughout his ministry.
Yeah,
he understands, substitutionary atonement. He understands grace alone through faith alone. As far as I can tell, he's never explicitly added works to the gospel. Yet he has spoken of terms like white privilege and things like that. And so, to an extent, what the documentary does, it takes some of his quotes where he uses those terms, and it splices it alongside of full-blown critical race theorists, who some of them who would claim to be Christians, but they're not. Like James Cone was a full-blown Marxist, and he preached a false gospel of basically, divest your power, white people, and that's it.
Yeah. He's the founder of Black liberation theology.
Right. And so they showed, like I said, clips from him, clips from Robin DiAngelo about white fragility, and then Matt Chandler.
And she's not a Christian, right?
No, she's not at all a Christian. Maybe she used to be, or would claim some weird variation of it, but no, she has it's not what she talks about. Um, yeah, and so like I said, Matt Chandler used some of that vocabulary, and they took those clips out, and so um, the way it was edited, if you don't know anything about Matt Chandler, you would assume he fully buys into all of that. I think. Whereas I think we both would push back and say we're a little more well versed in his overall ministry, and so it's a little bit cringe. Like, I don't know if he would. I don't know if that paints the right picture. So you brought up the way that it struck you, and you might be frozen. Let me check. Oh no, you're okay.
There we go. Yeah,
just the video. Just the video.
Okay.
So the way.
So
go ahead. Go ahead.
What I brought up was just to say I didn't really appreciate the editing structure of that.
Yeah.
I felt like it kind of villainized him in a way that I don't think was really just. Now, I do agree with your assessment that in the context of the video, he said those things, and he seems to be a little bit more sympathetic to CRT in that realm. At least to maybe view it as an analytical tool.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say in the context of his overall ministry, I don't really question his orthodoxy. I've heard him preach countless times. I used to be a very avid listener to his sermons as they were archived. I will be honest, I haven't listened as frequently these days, but that more has to do with just busyness of life.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, go ahead.
As I've gotten older and have children and now am pastoring myself, I find it incredibly difficult to fit in time to listen to other preachers who are not preaching at our fellowship. It's really difficult. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I can't say that I listened to him a lot at any particular phase. I did some as we went through some of his teachings in the church and things like that. But like I said, I've experienced a very sound gospel from him on many occasions. Yeah. But what I kind of said, I could see some people being a little too defensive and maybe saying the clips were taken out of context in the context of his messages. I don't think they were taken out of context in the context of his messages, as far as I could tell. He did say what he said, and the overarching message of the sermon was something I basically disagreed with. But they're taken out of context in terms of the overarching context of his ministry.
Yeah.
And that the people who made the documentary don't know him.
Yeah.
And I do think this is a blind spot for him philosophically. And so, it comes across more clearly. The best summary I could give it, I think, is that he says, CRT, this probably isn't the right quote. It was something like this. He said, CRT gives us like a diagnosis of the problem, but it doesn't give us the solution to the problem. And that sounds like he's going back to the gospel with it. But what my problem with that is, I think CRT as a framework doesn't give you a good diagnosis or a good solution. In fact, the diagnosis it gives you makes the gospel not a pure, simple gospel, not a tenable solution to the problem.
Yeah.
Because like I said, like this whole model of seeing things through the lens of race in this Robin DiAngelo kind of way, it makes this into a lifelong self-flagellating problem where there cannot be permanent unity in the church unless this version of the gospel extends out into political activism. And again, a very biased, specific political activism.
And I hate to say it, but it seems like the end desire is that the power structure just flips.
Right.
That the oppressor becomes the oppressee.
Right. And, it's a Marxist revolutionary kind of way of that's where it comes from, neo-Marxism. I think what I said when we were texting, the difficulty is that, and I think what causes the people who made this documentary and people like Matt Chandler talk past each other is that a full-blown heretic like James Cone would probably say something like, this addressing race is a gospel issue, and Matt Chandler would say it's a gospel issue. But they mean something very different. Matt Chandler has a bad diagnosis of the problem, but he has the right gospel as the solution, not seeing the incompatibility. Whereas a James Cone, when they say it's a gospel issue, they're saying that this kind of political activism is the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's a different problem than with a Matt Chandler.
Yeah.
And I think the documentary puts them together as the same problem. Like they think Matt
Yeah.
Chandler's doing
Yeah.
the worst of those two.
Yeah, because I think if you were to ask Matt Chandler and if you were to analyze his teaching, the segment where Cohn gives his version of the gospel, they show a clip of him explaining what he thinks the gospel is. Matt Chandler would flat out reject that.
Right.
And basically that, if you're wondering what that is he basically describes the gospel as the cross is symbolic of God identifying with the sufferer, and saying that if you want to be a Christian, you have to forsake your privilege and forsake your oppressing and join the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the gospel.
Right.
That's man's gospel. That's this version of the gospel, which is a false gospel. It's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if they were having a real conversation where they weren't just talking past each other, then maybe that could help someone like Matt Chandler like solidify a little bit here and be like, oh wait, maybe I'm not doing this right.
Yeah, and this is maybe why I'll blame a piece of this more on Matt Chandler, in that I think they didn't show it in the documentary, but the sermon they took one clip from, at the beginning of the sermon, he goes, "I don't have time for fools," talking about basically anyone who disagrees with him in the points of that sermon. And it was like, I think a lot of people watched that and went, "Ooh, he's talking about me." And it was like, what's his name? Who's the guy who made the documentary? I'm trying to remember. Tom Askell. I think Tom Askell saw that and was like, "Forget you," And so it's unfortunate, but I think I'm not saying that's exactly how the conversation would go if it was Tom Askell, Matt Chandler sitting down, and I don't even know if they've never sitting down.
I don't
know. It's unfortunate, but that's sort of and this is interesting. This is not, I remember James White's talked about this. He's sort of gotten the thick of a lot of this. He was like, I thought all of us being good old Reformed Calvinists, that would be a really unifying thing. And like, for me, that's how I felt when I came away from when I came away from the emergent church movement. I was like, ooh, wow, this, Reformed theology, this really is a unifying thing. Once these things click, boy, we're going to stick through thick and thin through a lot of things with this kind of stuff. But holy cow, I feel like this whole woke CRT thing coming in, it's like a second swing from the emergent church remnants, and it's way more powerful this time. And it's actually dividing Reformed people a lot. And yeah, I think that's a picture the documentary paints a lot, and it's sad.
Yeah.
And then it moved. There was a little bit of Voddie Baucham toward the end. I wish there was more of him in the documentary, but he was more in the portion on LGBTQ plus issues. But he basically shows like, look, because again, I mentioned this before, because all of these schools of thought and critical theories are so interconnected. If you buy into this if like a lot of Christians are looking at this and they're like, I don't want to go full blown left wing woke, but I do want us to address racism because that's a sin. But they think addressing racism means embracing this political mindset. But then all of the other critical theories sort of are attached by strings to it. And you don't know what to say once someone comes in and says, there's too much heteronormativity in this church, and your straight white maleness is causing you to interpret the Bible in a way that oppresses sexual minorities. And so you're an oppressor, and it's oppressive to even have a Christian stance on what's a sin sexually. It no longer again, critical theories, it's no longer an issue of individual sin. It's an issue of oppressor versus oppressed. And because you have the normative way of life, you're an oppressor. And so you can't even preach the gospel to every sin in the same way. But that being said, the other individual I think you felt maybe was edited a little bit out of whack a little bit was, what's his name?
J.D. Greer. So he was at the time the president of the SBC. And they show a clip from a sermon where he quotes Jen Wilkin, who is another Acts 29 affiliated person. And I'm familiar with her. I'm less so familiar with familiar with J.D. Greer, but I happen to be aware of this message because I recently read something about it. Um, and I think this is an instance where his words were taken out of context. Um, Basically, he says that very terrible paraphrase. The church has often really emphasized sexual sin as being worse or more severe, specifically LGBT, um, and yet the Bible doesn't really spend an incredible amount of time on that. It does tend to spend more time on issues like money, greed, stuff like that, like lust for power. And so I understand why it got lumped in with critical theory, but I don't think that was the heart of his message. In fact, I read his recent statement where he clarified and he apologized for the lack of clarity. And I will say I can definitely empathize with that because I can't tell you how many times after a sermon I've gone, man, I wish I had made that clearer, or I really did a pretty terrible job of making that clear. It happens. But he was not trying to portray the critical, queer theory or anything like that. And I felt like the way they edited it made it seem like that was his goal,
Mhm.
that this was a power dynamic at work and it was oppressor versus oppressee. And, that wasn't the point of the message, as much to say um, we tend to probably address the sin of homosexuality um, really heavy-handed. And I have some experience with hearing people really portray homosexuality as a sin that you almost have to be sanctified before you're justified.
Mhm.
And so I approached it as, yeah, I can resonate with that. I do think the church often does a pretty terrible job with issues like LGBT. And, so his quote, first of all, didn't bother me. And in fact, I tend to think I liked what he said. And, maybe if I give it another read, maybe that'll change. I don't know. But
Yeah, this was
I,
this was one area where we both watched it, and I think our different church experiences, we said like it painted the way we experienced it a little differently. And this is something I saw when I was watching sort of a conversation between Mike Winger and a couple guys in a podcast where they were saying what you're saying about their experiences in the church here more on the East Coast, and then Mike Winger goes, "So what state you guys from?" and they're like, "Oh, we're from, I can't remember the states." But then he goes, "Well, I'm from California. Where I'm from, I'm talking to people who have never heard homosexuality or these things addressed ever, like good or bad, anything from the church. They've never heard a hellfire brimstone, sermon, anything like that. So the fact that you would ever bring it up as a negative thing ever is shocking.
mhm,
And so like I just need to be super straightforward about what the Bible says." Um, and then the other guys were like, "Huh," but like I feel like we had a similar dynamic when we were talking about it, and that like you talked about your experiences in the church seeing that, and it's like, dang, like I could see that being super damaging. I grew up, I remember my dad was a youth leader, and there were people that he worked with as youth leaders or would bring on as help who struggled with these things, with um, different forms of sexual temptation. And there was, my dad was always talking about love and acceptance and forgiveness. That was like the motto of the youth group. And I never saw people get bullied in that kind of a way. And so when I see people talk about the long track record of horrible abuses in the church towards gay people or something like that, it doesn't resonate with me as much as some other people.
yeah,
And I get more skeptical, and I get
sure.
more impatient with it, whereas it's not true with everyone. And so it is interesting. Like I think different
Yeah,
aspects of the documentary will hit you differently based on your church experience.
yeah. And
Yeah.
and more than anything, I just right or wrong in his approach, I don't think he was trying to address or was influenced in that statement by critical queer theory.
Right.
I literally think he was just addressing it from the side of kind of like what I described is
Yeah.
we almost hold people who were homosexuals who have now gotten saved to a different standard than we hold somebody who got saved and their sin was heterosexual lust.
Hmm.
You know, it,
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the only issue I had with it, I think the wording he used was, he described the Bible as whispering about the issue. I think that's a little.
Yeah, I think that's actually the area he apologized for.
Yeah.
I think he added clarity to that. I might be wrong,
Yeah.
but I think that if I remember correctly, I read this article like 4 months ago. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, okay. Yeah, that's a lot of, like I said, it's a wide ranging documentary in terms of topics. And again, recommend it with all the caveats we offered with the criticisms, but I think overall it's a net positive in regard to clarifying the issues. In my take anyways. Do you have any other thoughts on it before we move on to a little trivia?
Yeah, I'll say this, but I'm not, this is one of those things I feel like it could be a launching off to a further conversation and maybe for a future one.
Mm-hmm.
I always, as a pastor, I always wrestle with the how much time should I divulge, this is not the right word. How much time should I invest into issues like this? Because, for me, I tend to preach a very simple gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I feel my goal is to encourage Grace Life, our church fellowship, and to deal with these things. And I don't know. I wrestle with the balance of how much do I deal with these like global impacting topics and in our little corner of the world. And, and this isn't the only topic, there's each week, it seems there are multiple people coming to me and saying, well, why don't you care about this? And why don't you care? And it's like, I do, but there's only so much time in the day.
Yeah.
And,
I feel like my brain jumps off into like two different ways. I feel like I would answer that. If it's even a conclusive answer, I doubt. But like one aspect is what is the relationship this has to the gospel, and how prevalent, how much do you see it impacting the congregation in relationship to the gospel? Because like we mentioned, if you embrace, like if you see a blatant racist in your church, you're going to address that in a gospel-centered way, but you're going to address the specific sin, right? I see you. Oh, you're good. Okay, good. So, but like, I guess what CRT does is it says that whether you see it or not, that is the case of all of your white church members.
Yeah.
And so I guess to the extent that you see that being imbibed by your congregation, your addressing of it is not a departure from the gospel, because you're getting them back to a proper gospel. And so I guess I wouldn't play them against each other. So that's one aspect of it. And you might not see it being imbibed by your congregation. And so for you, it might not be worth a constant, focus. Although it's getting more prevalent these days, whatever.
Yeah.
But then also like your eschatology is going to impact your view of it, because I think the more, like, as I've seen, depending on the pastor, like I think the more optimistic, like post-mill pastors tend to get more, they're a little more bold about their conservative political views, I guess.
Sure.
And so that's probably going to have an impact on how much you want to focus on it. I don't know. But I don't know. That's just sort of where my brain branches off when I hear that question.
I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
As far as eschatology goes, I'm still in the unregistered voter category. But I am doing
You
research
don't buy
and
into
studying.
everything I told you. Come on. No.
No pills were swallowed.